I talked to Greg, and you said that it was racist and deeply anti-Semitic, right? How, on a scale of 1 to 10, how racist was my podcast with Greg?
I mean, it was a little rough. I'm not going to lie, Paul. I feel in particular because it was so front loaded with Jewish stuff, right? Like you guys, like
nobody loves Jewish stuff more than I do. That's okay.
You guys did not like lead up to your ironic anti-Semitism. You just like led with that straight out of the gate. It's like zog, 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 the Jewish blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just, and I just think like you guys are playing with, I think, a little bit more fire than you're sometimes aware of. Because, you know, and frankly, like I've heard people like say this to me, that like there is a kind of like worrying trend of this kind of ironic anti-Semitism in youth culture that makes a lot of Jewish people who are like, let's not forget, or like absent from a lot of these conversations that you're having.
There were a lot of Jews at the studio, but who I had the same discussion with, FYI, and actually in far less censored or far less, you know, camera friendly, and it was very productive.
But I mean, you know, I do think that sometimes having conversations with like the world's most sort of eccentric
Jews,
well, eccentric, like post-Zionist, like, you know, whatever kind of Jews, right? Like
Zionist.
Well, okay. I mean, like, but the point is that I do think that this stuff is something that requires a bit more sensitivity than I think you've expressed.
Maybe
you know, when you're having these conversations, right?
Maybe. I mean, we'll go ahead.
Well, no, it's so I do respect the fact that that Israel is an issue that you take seriously. And I think that, you know, I don't fully agree with your opinions on it, but I can respect that you have a sincere interest in this issue and that you have a sincere interest in trying to understand the facts of the situation, particularly as it relates to Israeli domestic politics, which is, I do think, something that a lot of people tend to just completely gloss over and have no interest in. You know,
they just the settlers and the split between the settler movement and the secular Israelis.
Yeah. I think that's a very important insight, and I'm glad that you're engaged with that. And I think it's important when anybody takes a sincere interest in any political issue, if they're you know, they're motivated to sort of truly understand the facts of the case. And once you understand the facts, you know, those conclusions can lead people in different directions. But you do sort of seem like your heart's in the right place as far as this kind of stuff goes. But that being said, like in the course of sort of pursuing your passion on this issue, I do think that you play pretty fast and loose with a lot of these kind of like language tropes and conspiratorial tropes. And I think that's just very dangerous and bad and just like wrong. And I'm not even going to say I'm not even going to flatter you and say that it's counterproductive to your cause. I think it's like wrong on a sort of like normative level.
I see. All right. So this is JJ. The title of this podcast will be JJ McCullough officially condemns PF Jung. Finally, I told you at any point you are free to issue a public condemnation, and I will platform you while you do it.
It's like, but the thing is, like, you know, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic language is often on its face like ridiculous and sort of silly, and almost like silly to the point where it becomes kind of like, you know, funny, right? And it can be funny, I think, you know, to sort of play with some of these terms, but it is still dangerous. Like these terms are still very hurtful to the Jewish people who have had a long history of being on the receiving end of insults and mockery and hate and prejudice and all of these kinds of things. So this is something that I've hectored you about before, right? Which is that there is a sense that you know, that the history of Jewish people, the history of oppression of Jewish people, the history of persecution and prejudice in our culture, forgetting the culture of the rest of the world, is something that we have to be informed by. You know, in the same way that I feel like this is the case with anti-Black racism, homophobia, like there is a degree to which, you know, the sensitivity to these things can go too far. And there's also a degree to which the hate can go too far, to the point where it becomes kind of clownish and hard to even take seriously, because you just think, how could this
I agree.
Dumb? Right. But, you know, there is, if we're going to be radical centrists.
Exactly. There's a balance.
There is a balance, right? And I'm just not convinced that you've necessarily.
That's fine. That's fine. As our favorite hair doctor stated one time, very famously, in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. And I'm willing to risk being offensive. When Dave Chappelle makes jokes about shooting heroin-addicted white people, Okay, that's a real problem. There are a lot of heroin addicted white people, and like tens of thousands of those people die all the time. It's a very serious issue. And if someone got mad at Dave Chappelle because let's say they have family who died of a heroin overdose, I'd understand that. But ultimately, I'd be like, look, I can evaluate Dave Chappelle's motivations. I don't think he hates white people. People can make racist jokes, in the service of not being racist. Yes. And we explained it in that podcast what that was. And there's like three things. First off, that the reason we started with that in part is because I had just gone on Destiny's stream a week before and said maybe Israel did 9/11. Yeah. So it's like, well, it was a fairly topical topic at the time. Fortunately, there's been some well, not fortunately, but fortunately for me, conveniently, let's say, there was some personal drama in Destiny's life that seems to have swept my comments out of the limelight, which is fortunate. Not really. I wish more people saw that, and I'm pissed that more people didn't see my version of the video where I started the video by saying maybe Israel did 9/11. But anyway, I think you can use humor to critique and point out ideas and do it from a place of good intention. And I know what my intentions are. And even though Greg was like, no, see, Paul, you're doing it for good intention. I want people to be more racist. Yeah. It's like, okay, there's irony and all that. It's like, it would be a great disservice if someone like you were not keeping a check on me and saying, hey, you're playing with fire, because I am. But I know what I'm doing. I trust what I'm doing, and I know what my intentions are. And I'm not happy with Zog, so we make jokes about it. And also, real quick, one thing, because the framing, especially if people haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I am very suspect of this conflation between Zionism and Judaism, and saying like Zog is anti-Semitic in and of itself. It's like it refers to Zionism. If it was Jog, it'd be the dumbest meme ever, and I wouldn't say it. Yeah. And there are many, many, many Jewish people who are not Zionist.
Yeah.
And they would be in full-throated agreement of, Gabor Mate, Dave Smith, Norman Finkelstein, but people don't like him, although I love Norman Finkelstein. Mr. Borelli. But there's plenty of people, Jay Shapiro, Ian Pape, who are reasonable, level-headed Jewish people who agree that Zionism is not a good ideology to dominate American politics. And I'm not going to shy away from critiquing that, even if it is like, well, but Paul, you could be considered anti-Semitic. It's like, okay, well, people can call me racist for saying nobody loves black women more than I do. Okay, and to be clear, nobody loves black women more than I do.
Zionism is a term that I feel like has changed its meaning quite a lot, in the last 2 years or so.
Look, like, man and woman have changed their meaning in the past couple decades, so everything's changing.
I suppose it's true. I mean, the fact is, though, that when you say Zog, that has historically been understood as an anti-Semitic slur, right? And maybe you can sort of argue that came from a time in which people didn't make this distinction between Zionist and Jew, or maybe when people were using, but I mean, like the connective tissue is that, anti-Semites back when that term was first being popularized, and, anti-Semites today are inclined to use Zionist as a slur as much as they're inclined to use an accurate description of a certain political philosophy.
This is what people accused Jordan Peterson of when he said cultural Marxism. Well, that's a Nazi slur. Or that's what it's true. The Nazis did use that term. Okay, I just reject. Like, look at it. Look how it's being used in that context. It's so obviously not.
Well, so but that's again, it's just like, I don't know. You have to sort of choose the battles that you're willing to fight, and True. I just don't necessarily think that attempting to redefine or reappropriate or reterritorialize sort of slurs is necessarily something that I would make a big part of my personal political project.
I believe 100%. And I'll tell, and because we've hashed this out many times, and I'm sure the audience is sick of it by now. I will say one thing, just on a note. I talked to Kevin, the guy who interviewed you, Top Treaties, and we talked about iterated discussions and how is it useful for the same people to have like the same discussion to talk multiple times. I said that was my philosophy, was the best way to conduct an interview is over multiple interviews and build rapport. And I asked him, like, you've watched me and JJ's conversations many times. Is it productive, or does it get to a point where it's just like, well, this is JJ's perspective, this is my perspective, and it just is what it is? And I think he said it's useful. And people watching probably are doing this is like, well, they know where my perspective is, they know where your perspective is, and they understand there's a personality element to it.
Yeah.
And it's up, you know, ultimately it is up to them to evaluate. Am I being reckless? Because it's certainly possible I am.
Yeah.
Are you being overly cautious? It's possible that you are, you know? So I'll give you the last word on that. If there's other aspects of the podcast with Greg that you want to talk about. Maybe calling everyone autistic.
Yeah, that's, I don't know. We really are sort of in a, I mean, it does feel like we're in a cultural moment now where people are just being told to be offended less by things, right? Like we're just termed, I mean, as much as there's this kind of idea that, you know, we live in this era of hyper wokeness, and maybe we did, you know, a couple of years ago, I do kind of feel like things are swinging now, you know, particularly this becomes sort of the zeitgeist of the second sort of Trump administration, right? Where it's like, you know, woke is over now. And so now we're in this other sort of space where it's like, you can say whatever you want and don't be offended or you're a snowflake, right? And I think that, you know, there has to be a kind of, again, an enlightened centrist position on this, right?
Agreed.
There has to be a sort of sense where it's like, you don't just want to co-opt every offensive slur known to man and then get more angry at the people who get offended by these things.
Obviously, that's not what I'm doing.
No,
so
no.
But
if it's like an example, like here's a real world example, right? It's like, you know, Elon doing like the Nazi thing, right? It's like now you sort of see like right wingers sort of doing it ironically because they know it kind of gets a rise out of people.
True.
And so like the principle becomes
it's meta irony now.
Yeah, exactly. But it's sort of like, oh, like I'm enjoying that I'm offending people, and it's like the act of offending people by using an offensive thing is like this, like the more meaningful political act than, you know.
Well, I'd point out the left does that just as much with embracing Satanism to piss off Christians. The people who dress up as the devil and like drink blood and all that. It's like they know that they're embracing that aesthetic because it pisses off Christians. Yeah. It's not like they're,
but it's like, but again, like, you know, like it's like the Let's Go Brandon thing and things like this, right? It's like the degree to which mainstream, like Republican America embraces these things versus the degree that like mainstream Democrat America embraces these things. Like there's a fundamental disequilibrium in sort of the politics of this.
I'm uninterested with the plight of the goings-ons of the average Republican and the average Democrat. And you and me are so much more exquisite.
But it's not even the average, right? It's like you can imagine a scenario.
JJ, hold on, wait, JJ, I gotta do the thing. You gotta be careful with this, okay? It's twice now.
Go on with this, Paul. That's
like this is a white supremacist signal, okay? You gotta be careful. I'm just saying.
2015 called. They want their jokes back.
I'm pretty sure that's exactly what you said the last time I made that the other joke.
Well, clearly anyway, new material, Paul. This roadshow of ours.
Okay, yes, we're aligned here.
Okay,
we're aligned at least in the danger, and I recognize the danger, and I'd be a fool to pretend that you are not correct in pointing out the slippery slope of what I could be doing. Do you think I call people autistic too much?
I don't know. Like that one is harder for me to sort of talk about because, you know, like I'm well at least I know
JJ McCullough, he's not anti-Semitic, but he certainly is ableist. That's fine.
No, I mean, like that's no, I think it's I just have less experience with that community. So like I'm less sort of sensitive to their sensitivities around the language. You would have to sort of talk to somebody who is more engaged in sort of disability world or autism world specifically to kind of know the degree to which, you know, these kind of like, and I think about this, like I'm self-conscious of this, right? Like or like not even necessarily just calling people autistic, but like calling people schizo and stuff like that. It's like, is this hurtful? Are these terms that have been kind of like absorbed into the mainstream culture where they no longer have, you know, a kind of hurtful sort of meaning, right? Like we're having this whole conversation about this with the R word these days, right? You know, is that
which I don't say.
Yeah, and I don't say it either, but like clearly some people do and get away with it. And I even hear it on like some podcasts where like people like shift back and forth between saying it or just saying the R word, and like they can't even internally make it up themselves. You know, autism, calling things autistic, and that doesn't quite rise to that level. But like, I don't feel like I totally know. Like, I wouldn't make like a video. Well, actually, maybe I would make a video where I would like casually refer to something as being like an autistic obsession. Like if I was say talking.
Yeah, well, autistic refers to a particular way of thinking. It doesn't mean just dumb, right? And like when a term like that gets used to just refer to like dumb or stupid or I don't like it, then it is a problem. But like, and I know I don't use it that way because I refer to like when I talk about my videos that have complex PowerPoint diagrams and all that, refer to that as autistic type stuff. And
Yeah.
I'm the one doing it, and I think it's valuable and I think it's good. So I'm using that term in the descriptive way. Obviously, I can go overboard on it, I just because I'm a comedian and everything I do is legally comedy, therefore can't be sued.
But it's like for example, like I have like a friend of mine, his nephew is like severely autistic, like nonverbal autistic, and this kind of thing. And it's like, like that kid has a serious, condition, right?
Yes.
And I can imagine that people that are like close to kids like him would be sensitive to the idea of just sort of throwing this term around to mean anybody who's just kind of fussy, right? And so I don't quite know what the balance is on that. I don't quite know exactly what the opinion of people that are closer to legitimately sort of like diagnosed, sort of autistic people in that sort of way would be. So I don't know. I'm probably erring a little bit more on the side of caution than not.
That's fair, because you're a nice guy. Yes.
Well, I'm trying.
You're agreeable. Not. I mean that person. I mean that like you would score higher in trait agreeableness.
Yeah. And I just think it's like an important way. Like I do think that, society is in a rough place these days, Paul.
No.
Civilization is in a rough place, and I think it's important that I want to make a video about this or write something about this. I think it's important that we double down on our good middle class bourgeois norms.
I kind of like that Swiftian normality. It's called. You ever heard that term?
I believe I heard of it from you, but
there you go.
But no, I mean, like in another time, we would just call it like these are sort of like bourgeois sensibilities, right? And like that's kind of like we live in a middle class society. Our civilization is built on the principle that we're all basically like middle class people who go about our lives with a certain degree of sort of self control and prudence and moderation and temperance and all these kind of like traditional bourgeois values. And I do think that not using offensive language if you can avoid it, not engaging in needlessly provocative or disruptive or kind of like chaos inducing behavior is objectively a good thing. And so I think it's important that all things being equal, we try to err more on the side of caution when it comes to this sort of stuff. Whereas I think that now a lot of youth culture is much more the other way, which is like you should err on the side of being provocative, of being naughty, of being disruptive, and all of that.
That's fair. Anything else from my podcast with Greg that you wanted to condemn me over publicly?
Podcast with Greg, and the rest of it was just a lot of fun. Traditional banter between two characters like you. I noticed that I'm often
two strapping young Gen Z. I guess I'm Gen Z.
You guys, I do have to remind myself sometimes that you guys are both getting a little old yourselves, right? Like, I mean, you're not 22-year-olds.
I'm approaching 30 here in 2 years.
And so I do sometimes kind of like think like to what extent, you guys are growing and maturing in all sorts of ways, but I think it's important for you guys to have a sense of your own growing maturity and the degree to which, you can't maybe necessarily do the same shtick forever. So not saying that I can't enjoy some good shtick now and then, but there is a sort of sensitivity that I think you guys have to have that you're getting close to 30.
That's fair. We should grow up a little bit. I agree. Did you like my Joker impression at the end?
Yeah, that was. You're good at doing impressions, Paul. This is
really
an underrated skill of yours.
Nobody loves impressions. I know why you have your group therapy sessions. No, I won't do it now.
Like, for example, I haven't even seen the film, but I can tell that you're doing
Heath Ledger. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Horseshoe theory pod.
Horseshoe theory pod. Let me try to remember.
The main things we covered in that were destiny. The so-called conspiracies that you texted.
Oh yeah. There was too much of that.
There's none of that.
Well, here's an insight I have, Paul. Right?
Yeah. Well, no, wait. First off,
yeah.
Do you want to give your take on Destiny? By the way, you publicly condemn me right now. Do we want to take this opportunity for you to publicly condemn Destiny as well?
I was doing a stream the other day, a live stream, and somebody asked me about this, right? And it was for the first time that I kind of like felt myself kind of like hardening into this kind of like politician mode.
Oh, here we go.
Sort of like, well, how do you articulate your thoughts exactly in a way that is sufficiently sort of condemnatory and all the rest of it? And it's when there is, because then you sort of say things like, well, I think we should let the investigation continue, and all of the facts will come out in the court case, and I'm prepared to defer to the judicial system and all that. I'm like, on some level, I am. Like, I mean, on some level, like these are very serious and terrible charges that have been leveled against him. I think that, just as a kind of passive observer. Like, I'm not very well fluent in sort of Destiny lore. I remember I even said this when I was on Bridges. I said, like, you know, this is like the most I've ever spent consuming you, Destiny, is in this particular interview. So, but from what I understand, it's like there's reason to conclude that these allegations are credible because they seem to be of a part of a larger pattern of behavior in which he's been sort of routinely accused of you know, behaving very
sexual
badly.
impropriety.
Yeah, and I mean, but see, like, even this is like I don't want to be like too political about it and too like, you know, like, oh, he has behaved on occasion improperly with women, right? Because then that sort of feels like you're not sort of taking it seriously enough.
Yeah.
Like, you read the letters from the one woman who is making these charges against him, and you know, it's very sort of powerful and wrenching stuff, right? And so it's like you want to be sufficiently sort of deferential to the allegations of the alleged victim. But then, you know, you do also want to respect the process and these sorts of things. So, but I mean, like, but again, like, you know, I've never had particularly strong feelings about Destiny as a man. I'm totally prepared to accept that he is very bad when it comes to his dealings with women, and that he has a very chaotic personal life that, you know, is frankly quite repellent to me from what I understand of it. And it definitely makes me feel less interested in sort of doing stuff with him in the future, right? And so I think that, you know, the fact that Kyla, you spoke, I think, a bit about this, maybe you talked about this on your CJ podcast, right? Who I don't really know at all.
I've never met her.
I met her briefly once. She was actually in Toronto. But, you know, like the fact that she, who presumably knows Destiny better than anyone, is sufficiently turned off by this, that she is at least kind of like walking in the direction of cutting ties with him. I mean, we'll see though. Like, we'll see if that actually winds up being a thing. You know, Greg is, and he sort of talked about this in the podcast, he seems to be much more of the opinion that like this will blow over and that Destiny is sort of uncancelable in a kind of Trumpian sort of way. And maybe that's the case. Maybe Bridges will be back in a few months and we'll all just kind of shrug it off the way we shrugged off how he said that guy in Pennsylvania should have been shot, right? Yeah. So I don't know, but no, it's like, all I can say is that from my perspective, like, yeah, this is really offensive and abhorrent allegations, and it makes me less interested in sort of being part of his political projects going forward. Even though, like, again, like if we compartmentalize the personal from the political, I do think like there's a lot of aspects of Destiny's sort of political motivations that are sympathetic and I can agree with. But ultimately, we are holistic creatures. We contain a lot, and you do kind of have to think about the degree to which you want to be associated with, you know, brands, if we can phrase it in a sort of crass way, that have become tainted by very serious allegations of misdoing.
I think Destiny is a sexual degenerate and a hedonist and a moral anti-realist who rationalizes anything and everything for his own advantage. That's what I believe. And I've believed that for a while. I've called him, I've said it to his face. He acts like a sociopath. He is pure cold rationality embodied. You know, I guess this is a weird scenario that I'm learning to be in, and there's absolutely no playbook for this, where it's like, okay, am I a public figure, JJ?
I think you're,
at this point,
yeah, I would say so. I mean, you can be a small public figure, but still a public figure.
Okay, so now am I obligated to release statements when people I've talked to do things? I don't know. It's a genuine thing. One reason I was not in, like, you know, I don't know. I was the last person who talked to him before this happened on his stream. And I did say some wild, crazy shit that I was like, well, I'm not going to just, I don't know. I didn't want to make it seem like, well, because I said some shit, which actually perceived, the vibes might be wild and crazy, but factually and logically are, you know, very straightforward.
Yes.
I don't want to be like, well, see how terrible Destiny is? It's like, you just shut the fuck up, Paul.
Yeah.
So no, I don't know. It's a weird scenario. Like, what, you know, also, I've said everything about him to his face or about him before, of like, yeah, he acts like a sociopath.
Yeah.
But do I know if he's a psychopath? No, I don't know if Sam Hyde is literally a Nazi. Can we make inferences? Sure, probably. Do I think it's productive to just get up there and just say to Destiny, I think you're a sociopath? Well, what does that achieve? Other than me getting a clip or whatever? Like, you know, had this not happened and I was able to talk to him again, which I don't think will happen anytime soon or ever, I probably would have gone down the, can we talk about what you talked to Dr. K about, like your childhood and all that and how this affects things? Because my whole thing is, who you are as a person psychologically influences your political views. And only after a certain amount of rapport was established could I feel like could I go into something like that. But too little, too late. No one can save Destiny from his own doom, apparently.
But are you saying that you would not imagine, because I think this is a very real possibility, that Destiny's brand becomes very tainted and people like me, not to put myself on a pedestal, but people like me, broadly speaking, don't want to go on his show or participate with him.
Yeah, I've seen guests who were on Bridges say something like, "I'm donating this person's legal fund. I didn't even know this about Destiny. Yeah. Fuck Destiny."
No. And it's like, I've, not to get too deep into my own lore, but I've actually sort of rejected overtures, not for this reason, but for other reasons, based on other conduct that he's engaged in the past. But my question is that as he becomes more toxic to be associated with, I think that his standards for guests will naturally decline, and that there's probably a universe in which, say, not to insult you, Paul, but like, imagine if he says like, "Hey, Paul, come down to Miami. I want you to be on Bridges."
No,
you would resist that.
No, yeah, I don't, because what is it? Because I know now he's not interested in building bridges. He said as much. And he acts differently in different settings, and if I had to guess which is the real one, when he calls all conservatives artards and says they're all fucking dumb and they're bad people, and he wouldn't mind if he wouldn't care if his parents got killed at the rally that the firefighter got killed at because they're Trump supporters. Like, to me, that's probably the more real Destiny. And the one that's Mr. Borelli. That's more the real Destiny. The one that shows up on the Bridges podcast and intellectually is like, yeah, I agree with you, Dr. K. We should reach people where they're at and try to validate, and then never act it out.
Yeah.
That's the persona he puts on. So,
okay. Well,
and also, I'm not interested in appealing to Destiny's audience at this point. I think the people, I've talked to him 3 times. The people who would be interested in anything I have to say already know of my existence. They can come across my videos in their own time. And if they're like, oh, wait a minute, this guy actually makes better points than he certainly perceived to make originally, then so be it. So
that's fair. That's principled. I respect that, because I definitely think that when people become controversial in this way, there is often a temptation to for sort of smaller creators to kind of just sort of swallow their principles and just go along with it, because suddenly opportunities are open. Like, you see this a lot with kind of like crank media in general. Like, some political person becomes canceled for one reason or another, and then he like gets some sort of fringe YouTube show or talk show on Newsmax or whatever. And then, he invites all of these people, smaller creators, to go on the show. And they often like get very excited because it's like, this is the biggest opportunity that they've been presented. He flies them out to the studio or whatever. And there's some people that kind of get the stars in their eyes and can't resist the sort of allure of being in the proximity of a big shot, even if he's a discredited or disgraced big shot. And so I'm impressed to hear that you feel like you'd be able to resist that, even if he sort of says like, oh, I'd fly you out and put you in a nice hotel and pay for all of this and that, that you feel like the principle of the thing is important enough that you would say no.
Yeah, well, I'm such a good person, so obviously, that's why that would be the case. But
anyway,
we've sufficiently condemned Destiny. We've issued our statements.
Yeah. The other thing. One thing I wanted to say, and this is something that I noticed with your Greg chat, with your Horseshoe Theory, and with your CJ chat, is that these are all real love-in conversations, Paul. And
real what conversations?
Real little love-ins.
Love-ins? What does that mean?
With that term, to be like in a love-in, like a love-in. It's like, it's very like affectionate, like everybody is like, patting each other. Oh, you're so great. We love you. And like, it's just like this big old group hug, right?
I see.
And
cordial, you mean? Cordial conversations.
Well, yeah, that's one word for it. Yeah. But what I noticed is that when I talk to these same people, when I talk to Greg, when I go on Horseshoe Theory, even when I talk to CJ, there's always a lot more conflict, right? And that is interesting to me, because I am not like a super like hard-edged person, right? But I am a person that I think has very strong opinions on a lot of like tangible real world topics. Mm-hmm. And I do think that that's something that I didn't like as much about any of these three conversations, is
you
that they
personally
often,
slighted.
pardon me?
You
No,
personally slighted.
No, it's not about me. You guys can insult me all the live long day for all I
care.
But no, it's just like when conversations are too smooth, like that kind of gets my antenna up a bit, which makes me sort of think that nothing of substance is really being discussed. Because when it's all just like a conversation, and I mean, like, I don't want to cast too broad a brush. There was great moments in all of these conversations, and there was bad moments in all of them as well. But I do think that when things kind of get a little too soft and a little too self-congratulatory, when the only topic of conversation is like, isn't it nice how we can all get along? And shouldn't more people be as good as we are? And like, I'm willing to entertain any idea. And I think the most important thing is just that people make a good faith effort to understand one another, and just like, it kind of just never kind of progresses beyond that.
Funny that you're telling me this, because that's exactly the attitude I have, or at least had for a while, of like, dude, I don't like talking to people who I agree with. I want to talk to people who I disagree with. And or like on the Horseshoe Pod, it was more kind of explaining my, it was more like an interview sort of. So I'm just kind of explaining my perspectives and stuff, I guess. And so maybe there should be more debate. But, well, maybe if you showed up and were willing to debate more, next time I go up there, we'll go up there at the same time, and we'll do me on the Horseshoe Pod, and we'll do a debate like Joshua Citarella can come on, and then we can bring on CJ, and it'll be a giant panel, and it'll be the most vicious panel of getting to the bottom of things.
Well, I mean, but see, like, the thing is that, ultimately politics especially is about very real world, tangible things. There are options that are on the tables. There are policies that, you're yes, no on. Like, for example, right now, my country is under attack from America with these horrible tariffs, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like tariffs are like an issue, right? Like, we should be able to have a conversation about tariffs. We should not just be able to have a conversation about having a conversation about tariffs. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could get people that are pro-tariff and anti-tariff? I would be in favor of that conversation. I think it would be great if people were just engaged in a respectful exchange of ideas. It's like, no, at some point you actually have to have the conversation itself, not just the conversation about the conversation.
Here's the problem, though, and this is Destiny's problem too. And I learned this at the very end of the conversation I had with him, the last one I had.
Yes,
I agree. There are certain a lot of conversation, especially about politics, needs to inform action. Like, what are we doing here? Are we doing this? Are we doing that? Vote yes or no. Move in that direction. And Destiny and you, I think, being more vertical thinkers, not autistic, but vertical thinkers, recognize that and kind of prioritize that. Me, and I would say, I think Greg and Art Chad and probably CJ in the same boat. And we talked about this the last time you and I talked.
Yeah.
There are also conversations that are not about what action do we take, but what attitude do we have? What heuristics should we adopt so that we can get the best action around? And that is a different conversation.
I agree.
It's like, well, what do we do about tariffs? There's a lot of like particular things that are time constrained at this point in history. What's going on? There might be a yes or no thing there. But it's like, okay, how do we live together with people who disagree with us radically is not a policy question.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think that there's a limit to how often that conversation needs to be had. At some point, you need to move on. Because and I think that part of the problem as well is if these kind of like meta conversations are a substitute to learning actual facts about the political debates that we actually face. So it's like, if I ask you about Trump's tariffs, I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, that you have done very little learning about this topic.
Correct.
And you probably don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that's bad, right? Because then it suggests to me that you're not really plugged into the political space in a meaningful way. You're only sort of plugged into it, into those abstract sort of philosophical.
Well, hold on. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that I am not. Maybe it's good that I am not obsessed, but maybe it's good I'm not focused on things of which I know for a fact I have zero control over and could never have any control over in any short-term view. Whereas if I focus on the things that are more generalized, like political philosophy, how do we get along with people we disagree with? Well, 10, 15, 20 years from now, when I am the kind of person who actually does have a chance of influencing these particular policy things, I'll have done the basic foundational philosophical work to then be in a better position to make those judgments about, well, what should the particular tariff rate be on these goods at this time, in Canada. It's like, I think that is more detached from reality than thinking about the broader ideas that underpin all these things.
No, I think that's the completely backwards way to look at this.
For you, it's the opposite, because you actually are the fucking Joe Rogan of Canada, kind of. You actually could, your opinions on these things could legitimately inform policy. Now, maybe I'm underselling myself, I guess. I don't think so. I think it's I'm recognizing my limits and reach right now. So I get so there is a manifest difference here in that regard, and I would agree that you actually probably do have an obligation to focus more on those particular policy points.
But I think it's just, I don't think it matters like if I'm have a bigger audience or you have a smaller audience. I think that learning fact-based information about the policy debates that define our modern world is important unto itself.
But it's not more important than fact-based things about the psychology of political difference.
I think it is. I think it is.
Okay, this is just a fact of the matter disagreement.
No, but because it's just sort of like what are these skills that you're honing in the service of? Right?
I don't know, JJ. Maybe the skills that allow me when I have conversations with Greg, Archett, and CJ, it's all friendly and self-congratulatory. And anytime you talk to them, it's all.
But that's because like when I talk to these people, they know me for having tangible positions on contemporary political debates.
So neoliberal show.
Right? We hash out those debates. For example, when I went on CJ's show, we had a really good conversation about to what extent should the Canadian media be subsidizing the arts. You know, this is something that I'm very strong opinions on. CJ has very strong opinions on. And so there was tension there. And that's fine. It was constructive. But it was a debate about something real. And so as a result, the tension that existed was not a reflection of me being a more disagreeable person or whatever, but it was an actual conflict of ideas, which I think we handled well. And to me, I think that in some ways that is the more useful illustration of the principles that you're articulating, because you're not just preaching them, you're practicing them, right? And it's like, and it's not just about the ideas of ideas. It is about like, okay, these are the real world manifestations of someone trying to bring their philosophy into effect in the real world right now in the year 2025. It's happening from a president, it's happening from a prime minister, from a Congress, whatever. It's something meaty and thick and three-dimensional that we can touch and engage with. And I just think that like that has to be part of any project of anybody who professes to be passionate about communicating about politics, is that there has to be a component part of it.
I hate politics.
Public policy.
I hate politics.
No, you love politics, Paul.
Not really. If I loved politics, I would be excited to make a YouTube video giving my opinion on, for example, the Trump-Kamala Harris debate. I didn't do that, and the thought of doing that disgusted me. I'm like,
I suspect it probably intimidates you a little bit, because I think that you are probably a little insecure about your lack of knowledge. And
this is the second time you accused me about being insecure about something like knowledge-wise.
I'm insecure all the time. Like I get insecure that I'm not smart enough to talk about this, that, or the other thing, or that the task of doing the research to inform myself seems boring and intimidating, or that I'm going to get something factually wrong and people are going to make fun of me for it. I'm going to seem like a clown and all this. Like it's hard. Like learning fact-based knowledge in order to sort of have something useful to say about a contemporary political debate is not easy. I do think it is easier to just kind of like work out your internal morality and then have sort of conversations with sympathetic people who are inclined to like you, right?
Okay.
That's
I will let the audience decide. We're at an impasse once again of perspective. I will let the audience, and I do mean this, JJ, and this is something we should both be aware of, is like these conversations. I mean, as much as it's fun to like try, I'm trying to convince you of something. There is genuine value in people listening to this. Obviously some people are going to like me and my perspective more, and some people like you more. But I think most people are like, simply the act of this dialectic is just useful information for them. Yeah. And so we don't need to, reach resolutions or whatever. Which is good for me, because I'll never be able to get it through your thick skull. There are more important things than tariff debates. But
can I tell you about another novel theory of Paul? I know you love talking about yourself, so I feel like you'll enjoy this brainwave I had last night as I was walking home.
All right, hit me.
Okay, so I think you are prone to conspiratorial thinking, and I think that is just a defining aspect of who you are as a person. But I now have a more rich sort of theory about why this is.
Oh, nice.
And how this sort of fits into your somewhat crackpot theory of radical centrism as you understand it.
Yeah.
I think, and like, here, I'll say this. This is a sort of, it's not entirely sort of a Felicia's thing, is that I do think that you are a vulnerable person in some ways. And I think that over the years, you've learned to sort of make peace with your vulnerability. And I think that
what do you mean vulnerable? Like vulnerable in like, I'm
like,
willing to...
Like, I mean, just kind of like vulnerable in the sense that like you realize that like, you haven't always been strong. Like there's been things that have been painful for you in the past. And that's part of sort of who you are as a person. You were talking about on CJ's show, how you've gone to sort of therapy and that you have a difficult family background and this kind of thing. So there's a kind of vulnerability that is a part of who you are. And I think that your understanding of who you are as a person has been in part a journey of sort of making peace with that vulnerability and learning to sort of like internalize it and becoming a healthier, more well-adjusted person because of it. And I think that this lends you to see vulnerability as an opportunity for making connections with other people, including other people of other political tribes, right?
Yes.
Sort of say that vulnerability is something we all have in common. And by sort of understanding our vulnerability and the way that vulnerability and even frankly victimhood is a very common sort of human condition, and that if we can sort of like make connections on the basis of the degree of that we're all victims, that we're all vulnerable, that we're all being taken advantage of in different ways, that's a healthy place to go. The problem though is that I do think that when people overemphasize victimology in this kind of way or vulnerability in this kind of way, it can lead to a lot of credulousness for conspiracy theories, because then the idea is like, we're all victims. And so any political project should mostly be focused on, finding someone else to blame, finding the big evil elite superstructure that is the common enemy of all humanity, whether it's white or black or left or right or whatever. And so the correct way to sort of go about organizing a true sort of coalition politics is by sort of ascribing to these conspiracy theories about, Zog or the FBI or the CIA or the deep state or the military industrial complex or whatever else. You see what I'm saying? It's like, it's all based on the idea. And I feel like this kind of came up a bit in the horseshoe theory conversation when Brogan was kind of going off on something that you guys were all sort of like nodding your heads at, where it's like, oh, what's his name was trying to unify like the black and the whites.
Fred Hampton.
Yeah, Fred Hampton, right? And it's like, and that's
who the FBI indisputably killed and assassinated.
But it's like, you see, like, it's a narrative where it's like, oh, if only we had realized how we're all victims of the man, then we could have created a more sort of productive politics. And I feel like that's then sort of like what comes now with some of these left-wingers who are going MAGA, because Trump offers a very sort of conspiratorial view of American society, of American politics. And so if you are somebody that's like on the conspiratorial left, if you're a Russell Brand type or whatever, then it's sort of like, or even like a Glenn Greenwald type, right? Like if you're just so obsessed with this idea of that there's this like very sinister, actively evil American superstructure, then it's like, well, why don't we all just kind of like revel in our identities as the victims of this system, and then sort of adopt a kind of common frame of conspiratorial thinking in order to address it? And I think that's just bad. Like, I think that's just a very toxic development.
I think there's a kernel of truth to what you're saying in that if it was the case that there was this evil entity, this evil cabal, then it would be a unifying thing to demonstrate how we're all victims of it. Yes. So fine. It's a fact of the matter dispute now, JJ, of the degree to which, I don't even know what you call it, there's deep-rooted institutional corruption. Did you read the letter the FBI sent Martin Luther King?
Yeah, but Paul, how much longer?
Don't roll your eyes at me. Did you read the letter?
Yeah, I know. It's very
on a scale of 1 to 10, how close to a letter that the fucking mob would have written to someone telling them to kill themselves was that letter that was sent to Martin Luther King from the FBI?
But Paul, this is like 70 years ago. I think it is. I think we can adjust.
And who was held to account for it? We had the Church and Pike committees. Who the fuck was held to account?
I don't know.
Alan Dulles was on the warrant. See, this is my point.
But everybody who's even remotely associated with this are dead, right? Like, it's sort of like if you're sort of saying like, like at what point do we accept the fact that sort of the system has changed and that society has marched on, right?
Because cultural norms persist independent of the individuals in the institution. That's why like That's why institutions that have been around for hundreds of years have maintained their culture. Like the New York Times or the fucking monarchy in England or whatever. It's like, or company cultures. It's like cultures are passed throughout individual, unless there's a clean house. Well, the type of people who are willing to tell Martin Luther King to kill himself, which, just to be clear, you agree that is what happened, right? You know, you don't dispute that.
Yeah, of course.
It's okay. Yeah, of course. But this is my point. It's like, and this goes back to like Dr. K and Destiny's thing of like, you seem to have the same problem where why is your first instinct not to validate the conspiracy theorists' feelings who come across that? They're like, man, I just found out that the FBI basically fucking told Martin Luther King to kill himself.
But it's like, what?
They absolutely killed Fred Hampton intentionally with COINTELPRO. That's not disputed. Then you have Operation Northwoods, where the Joint Chief of Staffs all signed on plans to kill U.S. civilians.
But
now you say, look, JJ, even if it is the case, that we've held those people to account, and that there's no reason to believe that that's consistent anymore, which is bullshit. But whatever, let's just say that's the case.
Yes.
You understand how the average person would see those facts, or let's say come across those facts from their kook algorithms now that we're all victim to. My first instinct is to validate those facts rather than, clamp down on it. And I do not understand the impulse to do otherwise that you, Destiny, all your establishment shill fans, have that are going to comment, shit that I don't even read on here because I ban all negative comments that disagree with me. And I just don't understand that.
Well, it's like, what does it mean to sort of validate those beliefs, right? Like, I mean, it's fine to validate things on a factual matter, to sort of say like, yes, this happened or it didn't happen. But the fact is that's not what you're interested in. You're interested in drawing sweeping conclusions from the existence of these
What's
facts.
My sweeping conclusion that I think we should...
That we need to always sort of keep one eye open when we're sleeping because, the nasty FBI could do the same thing.
We should be skeptical and keep one eye open at all times.
But, this seems pretty preposterous, right? Because you're also, like, an opponent of the woke and all of that, right? So it's like, for example, like if I'm a gay
I am woke now, apparently.
Well, okay, so it's like I'm like a gay man, right? And so it's like, as you might have heard, and at one time being gay was a
mental illness.
Well, it was not only a mental illness; it was like a felony. Like you could go to prison.
Oh yeah, sure.
In my lifetime, over there in Texas, until literally Lawrence v. Texas, I could go to prison for engaging in sodomy, right? So does that mean that when I go to Texas today, I should sort of be in a heightened state of nervousness and apprehension because, like, you never know. Like, I could be thrown in prison tomorrow, right? That this could just immediately reverse and, back to jail.
No, but you'd be a fool to pretend that ethos is still not present to some degree in conservative rural America, which, by the way, JJ, it is.
Yeah.
I don't hang around there that often, but I can tell you that that's certainly the case.
No, but it would also be preposterous for me to not have moved on, to not have accepted the many ways in which Texas is obviously a very different society now than it was, a half century ago.
Yeah, this is why I'm not an anarcho, like, anarchist. We need to abolish all government entities or whatnot. It's like we need an FBI. Do we need the level of bureaucracy that they have? No, the FBI is a useful federal agency to deal with interstate crime, and federal agents in the field can go to local police departments and assist them with like catching murderers and rapists. Good. We need that. Anyone who goes too far and says, well, nope, the entire thing, burn it all down. That's nonsense. That's not what I believe. No. And I will say, perhaps it is incumbent upon me to draw that line clearer against the people who go too far. Because, like, for example, Eric Weinstein, one of my favorite quotes by him is, it's not that the elite in and of itself are bad. It's that the current people in the elite are incompetent and need to be replaced by a better elite. Like, Tristan Harris, the guy who did The Social Dilemma, that documentary about the social network. Wouldn't it be so great if he had some position of power when it came to regulating social media and algorithms and stuff like that? Like, that's such a no-brainer in my mind. Or Daniel Schmachtenberger is another individual. It's like, that's a very non-conspiratorial, moderate attitude to have of like, we just need better people in there, right? We need See, I could undermine myself by now continuing the irony and say, well, we need RFK Jr. in there, right, to clean all this shit up.
Secretary of Defense and Kash Patel running the FBI and all these kinds of people.
I'll have to watch those hearings to get a better idea.
This is not an irrelevant sort of part, right? Is because that if we rely too heavily on the conspiracy theorists to inform our understanding of institutions, then we logically conclude that the conspiracy theorist is the most rational person to be placed in charge of them, right? And that's how you wind up with...
Maybe else it depends what you mean by conspiracy theorists, because there's different, like people who say the earth is flat. I'm not putting in the same category as people who recognize the deep-seated corruption within the pharmaceutical industrial complex.
You know, it's sort of like here's sort of like the evolutionary chart of how these kinds of things go. I feel like with people like you, right, is like you find a crime in the past, you very fixate on it, and you sort of say, this is like the purest essence of what that thing is all about, right? So it's like the FBI, like some agent sending a letter to FBI, to Martin Luther King to kill himself. Like that is the purest essence of what the FBI is.
No, but it's a red flag.
No, I think you present it as that's you obviously.
No, I just told you I don't believe the FBI is purely evil, and we need an FBI.
No. I mean, obviously, it can be not purely evil, but you can kind of make the argument that we see the truest glimpse of its inner soul when we see the worst manifestation.
We see a red flag. Like if I'm on a date with someone, and she says, all these black people around here, I'd be like, that's a red flag. Can I that might be disqualifying immediately, but if I can,
it's like a better analogy.
You should be on guard for the rest of the time you're interacting with this person.
A better analogy would be like, like say she gets cut off in traffic or something, and she's like, "Oh, stupid black guy," or something like that, right? And you sort of say like, okay, is that like a glimpse into her deepest soul? Or is that just kind of like something that she said in a moment of weakness and vulnerability that is perhaps not reflective of, her?
Yeah, and maybe she comes from a racist household and that's just how she grew up.
Or maybe she was just in a point where she said something thoughtless because she kind of, was not thinking straight, right? Like there are times in which you can look at sort of instances of people behaving poorly and not conclude that this is a glimpse of food, right?
The FBI letter to Martin Luther King is one of several / many red flags, also including up until more recently. This isn't like 70 years ago in the past. The Garland shooter, which I also brought up on that podcast.
Yeah, that was pretty
Huh?
Hold on, which one are you talking about?
The one where the FBI informant encouraged a Muslim shooter to go to Garland, Texas, and shoot up the fucking place. The quote that the FBI said to the guy was, "You should go." The quote was, "Go tear up Texas." Okay, so they're still doing that shit.
Okay, well, I'm less familiar with that.
Well, maybe story. JJ, if you were as brilliantly educated as you are about policy when it comes to tariffs, you were about the corruption of the deep state, I think you'd be in a much better position than you are now. This
was the point I was trying to make, right? It's like when you sort of fixate on these like very sort of scandalous sort of episodes, and then you sort of draw the conclusion that this is again like the most representative sample, and that sort of creates a default disposition of paranoia, and then as a result it becomes natural and logical to elevate and celebrate the most paranoid amongst us as being somehow the most sort of clear thinking, and then you wind up putting like deeply unqualified people in positions of power whose only qualification is that they are paranoid and conspiratorial minded.
That would be bad.
And that becomes dangerous, right? Because then you start getting into the idea where those type of people, the Kash Patel type of people, have this like, adversarial relationship to other Americans, where their dreams are just dreams of sort of vindictive punishment, and because like they've already sort of created a moral universe in which these people are undeserving of anything beyond retaliation. And
you are pointing out a real danger, but I would say this is the same danger of saying like, well, on the left, if you start talking about if you start talking about saving the environment constantly and just constantly referring to big oil as this utterly destructive entity all the time, then eventually you can get to like eco-fascism and eco-terrorism.
And people on the right say that all the time. I mean,
and I would say correct. That is a valid slippery slope. You're pointing out the reality of a slippery slope, but pointing out the existence of a slippery slope does not then therefore say that invalidates the the reasonable middle ground that you need to get to in between, which is that the environment is being destroyed by a lot of these companies, and there is a lot of corruption in the permanent state that should be addressed, and it is pretty deep rooted, and it's probably in my opinion, the right attitude now is to probably take a more adversarial approach than normal in order to get at that deep rooted corruption. I'll give you the last word on this.
I just think that we have to sort of look at sort of the landscape of modern America and modern American politics and sort of think, who is on the ascendancy right now in terms of power and in terms of influence? And what sort of conditions have led to those sorts of people rising to power? And if we agree that these kinds of people are problematic, I mean, perhaps maybe you don't think that Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth and
I don't know enough about Kash Patel
and JFK or RFK Jr. Perhaps you don't think that these people being in positions of power is problematic. But if you do, and I think that most clear thinking people would, it's important to sort of like think like, well, what sort of cultural ecosystem has made their rise possible? Sure. And then I think we kind of do have to sort of like take a critical look at whether or not there are aspects of our culture that have maybe gotten a little out of hand and need to be reined in a bit. Yeah. And I would just sort of say that I do think this deeply, deeply conspiratorial, distrustful, paranoid, just overzealous attitude towards the sort of sinister motivations of elites is something that I think has metastasized into something pretty terrifying. And like, again, like this is not to like, I will concede, Paul, obviously we have to hold powerful people accountable. We have to hold institutions accountable. But, too much of anything can be bad. And I think that we're starting to see the where you can wind up if you've just kind of...
I love how you view that as a concession. Look, I will make the concession that we should hold the permanent state accountable for its corruption. It's like, okay.
You should be grateful for that much out of me.
My one sentence rejoinder, not even rejoinder, but just observation. Well, you can get the last word after this, is remember that by definition, reactionaries are reacting to something. And what you just said about what are the conditions in the culture that allowed someone like RFK to get into power. And I have my problems with RFK. Well, maybe if the regulators had done their job properly up front about getting rid of the genuinely bad shit in our food that should not have been there, that we shouldn't need an RFK to get rid of, it should have just been gone, and you wouldn't have someone like RFK.
Well, it just depends as to whether or not when we're drawing these conclusions, we are doing so in a good faith, fact gathering way.
Fine. We agree on that.
Or if we are just trying to validate pre-existing conclusions that we've reached based on, beliefs that we formed, when we were 15.
Nobody loves not blindly validating pre-existing conclusions more than I do.
That's great.
I don't think there's anything else from the Horseshoe Theory podcast.
No.
What about my conversation with CJ? My epic. That was the best way to cap it off.
Yeah.
I think people, at least from the comments, reacted that was the most productive, engaging conversation.
It was nice. I mean, I did feel like it was a little self-congratulatory, and again,
self-congratulatory, meaning like,
well, it's just like
I was congratulating myself, or CJ was complimenting me, and I didn't resist him.
No, I mean, it was just, but this is like my take on the CJ thing is kind of more what I was sort of saying before, because I do think that like of the three conversations you had, if there was one thing they had in common, it was like a lack of any sort of tension. Versus, when I go on these things and it's always defined by tension, right? And again, like, it's not saying that like I'm great and you're bad. It's just kind of saying it was just noticeable. And I thought that was sort of something that's worth.
Well, CJ and I, the first conversation that CJ and I had, there was a decent amount of time. We argued about postmodern neo-Marxism and whether or not that's a valid concept. We argued about non-binary pronouns and stuff. We specifically, kind of the point of that conversation was, how is it that someone two people who are as antithetical aesthetically, let's say, my everyman white nationalist haircut, frat bro looking kind of, vibe, and then CJ's vibe, they, them, non-binary type person. It's like, how is it that us two are able to have productive dialogue in a meaningful way that could actually produce consensus? Like this is a total, like someone like CJ, I could see at some point in the future, like if I gathered and say, hey guys, 3 months from now, we're going to all get together in this one city and do some political activism of some kind. He's Canadian, obviously, so that's, difficult. I don't want to be involved in foreign election interference, but it's like that's important. And so that we specifically, like, we could have argued about non-binary stuff. We could have gone back and forth about, well, why do you hate Trump, CJ, and Paul, why do you have a problem with the left, and what do you think the excesses of the left are, and all that? It's like I've had that conversation with you many times. And so there was, I guess there was a point with CJ to be like, we are trying to reach synthesis here. And there was a decent time. It wasn't just like agreeing with each other the whole time. It was a discussion.
I mean, it was but what I'm saying is that I think I want to see a bit more showing, not telling, right? So It's like, if, like, and this is what I mean when it's self-congratulatory. Like, it's easy to say, like, oh, look at us, we're so different, and yet here we are together. It's like, okay, but can you, like, maybe manifest a bit of that difference in
We were in the same room. I was sitting on his pink flowery couch drinking a pink teacup. Yeah. Now, to be fair, I was on my apology tour after my incident with Destiny, so that was part of it.
If our standard for sort of the great coming together that's going to sort of save the culture is merely just people being in the same room together, I mean, like, maybe we're setting our bar.
Unironically, that's a good first step, though.
I suppose it is, but I feel like you guys are sort of intelligent enough that you could have maybe ratcheted things up a little bit and not just spoke about the importance of coming together, but actually modeled a civil disagreement, right?
Interesting, because I would suspect that there are people who watch that conversation who would say that's exactly what they did. We sat together and we talked and we discussed things. Like, for example, what would you have liked for us to discuss?
Well, like the whole sort of non-binary gender stuff. I mean, this is like the first issue that I associated with you when we first started talking. I mean, you've now kind of shifted your priorities to being the Israel guy now, but. Yeah. But definitely, like, I would have liked, because, I mean, obviously CJ has very strong feelings on all of this, on stuff relating to gender and queerness and on all that. And, like, it would have been interesting to sort of see you guys model a kind of civil disagreement if you guys do in fact substantially disagree on these issues, which you would probably purport to. Like the Trump thing. Like, I think Trump is obviously like the defining sort of political thing, and to merely just kind of like sort of shrug it off and being like, oh yeah, well, we probably don't have the same agreement. We probably don't have the same opinion when it comes to Trump, but that's fine. We're both in the same room together. It's like, that's interesting to me. Like, I want to hear the nature of this disagreement, because presumably you guys are smart enough to not have just a disagreement based on something frivolous, that it presumably is grounded in something that does challenge both of your moral frame.
I would say this critique. Well, first off, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with this critique. I get the point underneath it.
Yeah.
To the degree that you're making this critique, I would say it applies to CJ.
Yeah.
I'm happy to argue about whatever all the time, as you know.
I know.
CJ, but in some sense, because CJ is on the left, the progressive left, one of the hallmark characterizations of the left is sort of focused on kind of compassion and having empathy and compassion be the kind of the highest value. And I'm happy to explain very clearly why I would have preferred Trump over Kamala. In fact, I would have been happy to have that conversation. But it's, but then that puts the obligation on CJ to be completely informed about all of the, now CJ has to be the kind of person who, aside from reading all of these philosophical works that allows him to make all these videos that are very rich and very valuable in and of themselves, well, now he has to also be ready to argue about the border and the degree to which our open border is a problem. And
but this is important, right? Like, if you guys feel like you're not informed on these issues, well, then maybe you don't actually have meaningful opinions, right? So it's like, I
don't. That's why most of my videos are not talking about Trump and Republican politics.
But then, Paul, then you cannot congratulate yourself for getting along with somebody that you don't agree with when you guys are actually just too ill-informed to actually disagree.
No, because our disagreements are not on particular policy so much, although there are disagreements there, but on philosophical approaches. Like, I would purport to CJ. This is one of the things that came up. CJ talked about how, like, he's glad that there is like someone like Noah Samson talking about working out and self-improvement on the left.
Yeah.
Because there's this whole weird scenario where working out is now right-wing coded somehow.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I would have and perhaps I should have done this, to your point, is say,
Yeah.
well, hold on, CJ, this is a feature of the left-wing philosophy that the left are the ones who will say, the left, I'm using broadly here, the very progressive left, well, the ones who will say elevating workout culture is ableist because there are people who are, who can't work out.
Yeah.
And it's like, and my response would be, well, the proper attitude towards that is tough shit. Life is tough.
Yes.
And progressive leftists have a very difficult time doing that.
Yes.
Although not for like racism, because, and I don't think I think they should just be like, fuck you. If you say that you like black people, black people shouldn't be in America, then that is the attitude you should have towards them. Fuck that, right? I mean, you can do a Daryl Davis type thing and try to break it down, and I do that to some degree. But generally speaking, like, we only have so much empathy before we exhaust ourselves emotionally.
Yeah.
And I would have happily have had that discussion. But then that puts CJ in an awkward spot where now he's defending this thing, and it's like,
but what's wrong with that? What's wrong with defending something?
Because that wasn't the goal of the
maybe it wasn't, but but it's fine. It's like the conversation can be whatever. It's not my show. You guys can do whatever you want on it. I'm just saying that from
everything is your JJ. This whole world is your show. All right, we're all just side characters, and
well, certainly from my perspective, that's true.
Yeah.
What I'm sort of saying is just as the viewer, I feel like it would have been more interesting and useful to me to see you guys sort of explore an actual real world tangible issue on which you disagree. And then this actually, I mean, the working out thing is, I think, a very interesting example of this, because this reminds me of something that you brought up earlier and that I think we once bonded on previously, which is the idea of when people like say somebody on the left concedes a point to someone on the right, it's very easy to just kind of like passively concede it. But what is more interesting and is more useful is when we then ask that person to double down, right?
Yeah.
So like if you
draw the lines clearly,
Yeah.
like I was saying that I need to do a better job of with the conspiracy theorists potentially.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? So if you sensed that there was an interesting like little sort of unorthodoxy that CJ kind of casually threw out, if he casually conceded your point about fitness culture on the left, then maybe, it would have been interesting to see you like sort of needle him a little bit about that. It's like,
maybe.
let's
agree. I agree.
A little bit more about that. Really, CJ, you don't think there's anything ableist at all about?
That's exactly what I would have done. I would have just I would have played the devil's advocate there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, fair. Yes, from a pure discussion perspective, but there are other considerations, like the fact that CJ is probably taking a risk just by showing up in the same video as me. Given that I, for example, am happier that Trump won over Kamala Harris. Like, there are you surely there are people who regard that as grounds for getting cut out of like their life, right?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about that in the video with your friend at the party who was like,
oh yeah, which. And I'm not gonna. I'm yes, okay. I get the point you're making. There's other considerations. I'm happy that we had that discussion. And the next time I talk to CJ, we're only going to talk about workout culture and condemning the ableist left, or condemning the hyper compassionate left, or something like that.
Because you're now becoming a gym bro, right?
I've always been a gym bro.
Is that so?
I mean, I've gone like months without working out or done very limited stuff. But ever since high school, it was in the gym, protein shakes, all that shit. More recently now, I'm doubling down on it, doing a lot more sauna. I'm even running now. I'm improving my cardio. Which, sorry to all the no-legged people out there, I didn't mean to marginalize you with that statement.
That's the only exercise I do, Paul, is cardio.
Is running. Honestly, you should do some weight. You don't have to do like to failure, but weightlifting is good. Especially from a brain health perspective, I think.
Well, I mean, I've also sort of become more sensitive to it as I get older, because like you do, like that is an interesting thing. Pardon me?
Your joints are kind of souring up.
Your body does decay over time, right? Like things do become harder. I mean, I'm only 40, like I'm not that old, but there are like subtle things that you do begin to notice, and you do realize, like, you become more self-conscious of the aging process, and it's like, are my bones, are my muscles, like, are they strong enough to, like, am I on the right path so that when I do become an old guy and, sort of life becomes more difficult in all sorts of ways, will I still have, sort of like the physical strength to just kind of, get through And you do think about your appearance as well. Like you see people that are older, and some people are in good shape and they look very attractive and they look younger than they are because they put effort into making their bodies strong and good looking and all that. And then there's people that have just sort of given up, right? And then they look much older than they are, and so they're not only sort of physically weaker, but they're less attractive, and then that takes a toll on the self-esteem and all of these kinds of things. So I mean, it is something that I try, even though I'm not the best embodiment of this myself. I do think that like physical fitness is a very important part of people's sort of holistic sort of sense of well-being, and I definitely think that it's something that young people in particular kind of have to develop good habits for when they're young, so it can become a lifelong sort of
That's true. What it is. Once you've gotten in like decent shape one time in your life, your body is able, it's much easier to get back into that shape at a later point in life.
Yeah,
like
precisely.
Not just like mentally, but your body is able to make that connection again easier.
Yeah.
And I will say, JJ,
sorry?
You said you're 40?
Well, yeah, I am 40.
You don't look a day over 37.
Oh, well, thank you, Paul. But no, I mean, it's true though. But it's like when I talk to other like men in their 40s, you definitely see like there's sort of two categories. Like there's ones that were just never developed good fitness habits when they were young. And so now they sort of are old and out of shape and weak and fat and all the rest of it. And then you see guys that are in really good shape and look younger and, are, more content with life. And what the line that they always use, I'm sure you've heard this line where we're talking about like maintaining, right? So like there's a certain point at which when you're a younger man, you sort of hit a sort of natural plateau of how fit or healthy you're capable of getting or interested in getting. And then, but for many subsequent decades, you can like maintain that level of health and fitness for a long time. And I do think that it's difficult to maintain something that you never achieved. And it's also very difficult to kind of get to a certain level of health and fitness when you're old, because just so many things just become so much harder to do when you're middle-aged, right? Let alone when you're in your 60s or whatever.
Can I ask you, maybe we can end with this, because we talked about this over text, elaborating on because you are right. I do like talking about myself. I do like hearing other people's opinions on me.
I know.
You think that I have sort of the everyman aesthetic, and that sort of helps catalyze, like, people see me as, oh, I have a brother or a friend or an uncle or someone like that, and that works to my advantage. And you think that's okay? Because I'm kind of inclined to maintain my, I wear very solid color t-shirts.
Yeah.
I just bought like a bunch of these online. They're nice fitting, and they're not super, out there. I was talking to CJ about this a little bit of like, I'll let my comments on Israel do the demonstration of how fiery my personality is. I don't need to wear fancy clothes and whatnot, but
yeah.
But you think that's do you think that's a kind of a relatively significant part of my success, quote unquote, is the square aesthetic that underpins it?
I think aesthetics are hugely sort of consequential, right? Like, I mean, I think of how people perceive me because of like how weird my hair is, or the sort of things that I dress, and when I have mustache and like all these kinds of things. Like they sort of project a kind of sense that this guy is this kind of like arty, kind of eccentric, sort of hipster kind of dude, and and people sort of draw certain conclusions for that, positive and negative. And I definitely think that in the sort of the realm of the kind of like ideas sphere, in terms of like the content creators who are interested in politics and philosophy and whatnot, there is always a kind of like erring on the side of eccentricity, right? Like these people, if you had to like gather like 100 of them, they'd probably be more on my end than your end, right? And so as a result, and the ones that are on more your end would be the ones that would sort of have, I suppose, what you would describe as like the normie kind of opinions or aesthetics. They'd probably be people like the sort of like the standard journalist types, or, people that, are pretty orthodox liberals or conservatives,
Sure.
So for someone to kind of have somewhat eccentric opinions as you do, but then also present as such a sort of aggressively kind of just square, kind of Captain America type, right? Like it's
aggressively square.
It is sort of it is disarming in a way, and I think discombobulates people. I think it probably makes people more critical of you than anything else, because I think that if you're inclined to believe somebody is ignorant, we have certain kind of aesthetic expectations of what we think an ignorant person.
I look like someone who would be ignorant.
Well, I mean, I think that if somebody wants to think that,
it's easier to
think that about somebody that looks like you than say somebody that looks like me. You know, but it's not.
I believe that. Yeah.
But it's not just that look, right? Like, say if you were like a big fat guy who always wore like trucker caps, you know, people would think that that's a sort of ignorant guy as well. And I think a certain kind of like basic white guy, which I do think you exude a bit of the energy of, you know, is easy for people to dismiss as ignorant too.
I'm a champion of my people, basic white guys.
Basic white guys. But it's also because like you talk in a very particular way. You have a kind of like wry sort of sense of humor, which I think is kind of like playful, and that sort of creates a certain expectation as well. Or because you play into the idea of being a little bit dopey, right? Like you kind of like that. Like you like that people are a little, you know, I think attracted to it, but also maybe a little frustrated by it.
Well, I have always liked people underestimating me. Like I remember even from being young, like I was part of this advanced like academic program when I was like in elementary school, and you know I'd go out in the playground or whatever, or like at gym or you know the blacktop, and you know I'd hang out with someone, and then like a week later they'd find out like, oh, you're in that program. Like,
yes.
Yeah. I was like, oh, cool. All right. You know, I don't know. There's something about that. Like Jordan Peterson said this about Theo Vaughn. Like Theo Vaughn plays into the dumb hick kind of thing, which he definitely does because he's obviously very smart. I don't like intentionally. I recognize I am genuinely like not smart. I'm not as smart as I could be. And I'm ignorant on almost everything all the time. So in some sense, part of why I'm happy to like lean into that aesthetic is because it's more honest than what people often do the reverse, which is like lean into the intellectual aesthetic when they don't know anything.
Yeah.
Right. And there's certainly people, you know, we won't go into names, but there's certainly people who are like that.
Yeah. To be clear, I have no problem with your aesthetic, Paul.
No, I know. I think you appreciate it.
Change it. I think it's actually like it's something that works for you. And that was your original question, right? Like, listen.
Nobody loves flattery from gay men more than I do, JJ, all right? So I appreciate it. What I was going to say about you is, we talked about this briefly over text. Is like there's three JJs in my world. Okay. There's JJ McCullough, the video maker.
Yes.
Hello, friends. My name is like Eeyore, kind of. My name is JJ, and today we're going to be talking about Funko Pops. You know, like this very, you know, utterly inoffensive, wholesome, da-da-da. And then there's JJ on stream, which is much more, we can go back and forth, and you call out the crackpot nonsense whenever it rears its ugly head. But then there's some, and people are familiar with this, but I'm in the incredibly privileged position that most people will never know, that there's also Text JJ, which is the most edgiest, you know, the best JJ, in my opinion, of just constantly dropping bombs all the time on me or whatever. Which is genuinely hilarious. And I think that I told you this, I think you need to make a video that says you're killing the old JJ McCullough on your channel. This old sort of, you know, friendly neighborhood uncle type guy.
Yes. And
you need to become the true edgy, dark JJ McCullough, the dark centrist JJ McCullough, because it's so much better. It's so much funnier. And I don't know. I think it closer matches who you are when it comes to, you know, you being able to articulate genuine gripes about nonsense wherever it may manifest.
Well, you know,
when are you gonna become dark JJ?
When I'm going to become dark. I mean, this is why I think this is why Destiny is so compelling to a lot of people, including sort of people that like me who maybe sort of share a fair bit of his politics. Is that he is somebody that is just comfortable being the dark version of himself, somebody who's comfortable throwing around the R words and just saying, "I cannot believe how stupid you are," and you know, like doing all this kind of thing, right? So it is sort of a temptation. I guess it's just, I do care so much about these kind of bourgeois norms I was talking about before. Like it's not insincere. Like
That's fair.
You talk, and it's like what we talked about before. If we can bring the whole circle back, right? It's what you talk about communities, and it's like communities, friends. You talk differently to some people than you do, you know, to other people, and you know, sometimes it's a reflection of the kind of the intimacy that you feel, so you can let your guard down and you don't feel as vulnerable. Or so I don't know. It's like, but you can't. It's you. Surely, Paul, you would not want the special thing that you and I have,
right?
Only we get to enjoy in our text.
Exactly, to be spread amongst the peasants. God,
right? Because then that sort of devalues the friendship that we have offline. Right?
True. One day when you die, at your funeral, I will only after you are dead and gone, and you're atheist, so it won't matter what happens after you die. I will go through and I will read the top 10 JJ-isms I ever received via text.
I don't think. I mean, people are probably getting the impression that like I'm some sort of real edgelord.
No, you're, and it's not like it's not anything. It's not anything like, it's not inconsistent with anything you've believed or like, it's just the way it's also partly you're Canadian and they're a Canadian for like beacon off, like, oh, that's that thing that such and such is beacon off all the time about. That's just funny. It's endearing, I would say. Well, great, JJ. I think we have come full circle. I think the title of this conversation will be JJ McCullough finally condemns, all caps, PF Jung and Destiny. I think that'll be the most
clickbaity.
Most clickbait. Well, but it is. But I mean, it's not clickbait if it accurately reflects the content.
That's fair. All right. I'm fine with that.
So,
and then that way you'll get you'll ensure that Destiny will watch it in a.
I don't know. He might be on a Fortress arc where he's not like pulling up criticism of him on. I mean, he might watch it offline, but he's on stream all the time. So.
He's got to find something to fill those 8 hours a day.
It is, yeah, well, 12, I think. But yeah, it is, maybe it may only be 8. It is interesting if you go see his recent videos, like all the comments are like, you were the chosen one, and now you've gooned too close to the sun.
So people are actually, I mean, not to get off track here, but people are like striking back.
Well, I mean, there's only so much info you can glean from the comments. Remember, like 2,000 comments on a 5,000 view video is less than half of the people.
Yeah,
and that's utterly rare.
But
it does seem like it. Yeah,
well, keep an eye on it, and I'm sure that if there's any big breaking developments, the PF Jung channel will be the place where I'll go.
Yeah, maybe I have a strict there's bigger fish to fry at this point in the world. Destiny has met his destiny. Let's say his persona has become manifest. Stephen Bennell has encountered the destiny for real. But anyway, thank you, JJ.
Thank you, Paul.
Godspeed,
my friend.